Doris Day was sitting in her dressing room at 20th Century Fox when Marilyn Monroe walked in without knocking. The year was 1953, and the two biggest female stars in Hollywood were about to have a conversation that would split Tinseltown down the middle. "We need to talk," Marilyn said, closing the door behind her. Her voice wasn't the breathy whisper the world knew. It was cold, calculating, and filled with something Doris had never heard from her before: pure hatred. Doris looked up from her script, surprised by the intrusion and the tone. "Marilyn, what's wrong?" "You know exactly what's wrong," Marilyn replied, her blue eyes flashing with anger. "You've been playing the innocent little girl act while stabbing me in the back." That confrontation was the beginning of the most vicious hidden rivalry in Hollywood history. The feud between America's sweetheart and the world's most famous sex symbol that would divide movie studios, destroy friendships, and create a war that Hollywood is still talking about today. Now I'm going to tell you the story of how Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe became bitter enemies. The hidden rivalry that split Hollywood in half and created the most explosive feud between two women that the entertainment industry has ever seen. The seeds of their rivalry were planted long before they ever met. In 1950, Hollywood had a very specific idea about what female stars should be. There were only two acceptable images for women in movies: the wholesome girl next door or the sultry sex symbol. Doris Day had claimed the wholesome territory early in her career. With her bright smile, sunny disposition, and all-American good looks, she became the embodiment of post-war optimism and traditional values. Studios marketed her as the girl every man wanted to marry and every mother wanted as a daughter-in-law. Marilyn Monroe, meanwhile, had staked out the opposite end of the spectrum. With her platinum blonde hair, hourglass figure, and sultry screen presence, she became the fantasy woman that men desired but could never bring home to mother. Studios marketed her as pure sex appeal wrapped in vulnerability. For several years, this arrangement worked perfectly. Doris dominated the romantic comedy and family film market, while Marilyn ruled the glamour and dramatic role. They existed in separate Hollywood universes, never competing for the same parts or the same audience. But by 1952, that careful separation began to break down. Both women were evolving as actresses, and their career paths were starting to intersect in dangerous ways. The first crack in their peaceful coexistence came when both were offered the lead role in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. The studio had originally written the part with Doris in mind, a sweet, naive girl who gets caught up in romantic adventure. But Marilyn's agent convinced the producers that his client could bring a new dimension to the character. Marilyn got the role, and it became one of her biggest hits. But Doris never forgot that a part written for her had been given to her future rival. The second incident was more personal. At a Hollywood party in late 1952, both women arrived wearing nearly identical gowns, white, flowing, and elegant. The fashion press had a field day comparing them, but the photos told a story that both women found disturbing. In side-by-side pictures, they looked remarkably similar. Same height, same build, same blonde hair. The only real difference was their styling and attitude. It was as if they were two versions of the same Hollywood ideal competing to see who could embody it better. The media began to notice the similarities and started making comparisons. Articles appeared with headlines like "Battle of the Blondes" and "Who's the Real Golden Girl?" The press was actively trying to create a rivalry, and both women were smart enough to see what was happening. But the real trouble started when they both fell for the same man. His name was Arthur Miller, the famous playwright who had written Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. He was brilliant, sophisticated, and represented everything both women thought they wanted: intellectual respectability. Miller had come to Hollywood in early 1953 to discuss film adaptations of his plays. He was introduced to both Doris and Marilyn at separate industry events, and both women were immediately smitten. Doris saw in Miller the kind of serious, thoughtful man she had always been attracted to. After her disappointments with Martin Melcher and other Hollywood types, Miller represented a different kind of masculinity, one based on intellect rather than ego. Marilyn saw in Miller a chance to prove she was more than just a pretty face. She had been studying acting seriously and desperately wanted to be taken seriously as an artist. Miller represented validation of her intellectual aspirations. For several weeks, both women pursued Miller without knowing about the other's interest. Miller, flattered by the attention of two of Hollywood's biggest stars, didn't discourage either one. The collision was inevitable. It happened at a private dinner party at the home of director Billy Wilder. Miller was the guest of honor and both Doris and Marilyn had been invited. Neither knew the other would be there. Doris arrived first, looking radiant in a simple but elegant blue dress. She and Miller were deep in conversation about his latest play when Marilyn made her entrance. Marilyn had clearly put extra effort into her appearance that night. She wore a stunning red dress that hugged every curve, and she had styled her hair in loose, seductive waves. Every man in the room stopped talking when she walked in. Miller's reaction was immediate and obvious. His attention shifted completely from Doris to Marilyn, and he barely acknowledged Doris for the rest of the evening. Doris watched in mounting anger and humiliation as Miller hung on Marilyn's every word. She saw the way Marilyn touched his arm when she laughed, the way she leaned in close when he spoke, the way she made everything about her seem effortlessly sensual. But what hurt most was seeing how easily Miller was manipulated by Marilyn's act. The man she had thought was different, more substantial, turned out to be just as susceptible to obvious sexual allure as every other man in Hollywood. Doris left the party early, but not before she and Marilyn had a brief, tense exchange by the powder room. "He's not what you think he is," Doris said quietly. Marilyn smiled with false sweetness. "Oh, honey, I know exactly what he is. The question is, do you?" That exchange marked the beginning of open hostilities between them. Within weeks, the entire Hollywood community was aware of the tension between Doris and Marilyn. It wasn't just about Arthur Miller anymore. Though Marilyn did end up marrying him in 19, it had become a fundamental clash between two different visions of what a woman could be in 19. The rivalry played out in subtle but vicious ways. At industry events, they would arrive within minutes of each other, each trying to upstage the other's entrance. Their publicists began planting stories in gossip columns that subtly undermined the other's image. Doris's camp would leak stories about Marilyn's difficult behavior on sets, her lateness, her demands for multiple takes. Marilyn's camp would plant items about Doris being cold and calculating behind her sweet public persona. The studio system, which had previously benefited from having both types of stars, began to take sides. MGM, where Doris was under contract, actively promoted her as the real woman that audiences could trust. 20th Century Fox, Marilyn's home studio, pushed back by emphasizing Marilyn's authenticity and vulnerability. Directors and producers found themselves having to choose sides. Working with one woman could mean being blacklisted by the other's support. Some of Hollywood's biggest names were forced to declare their loyalty publicly. Frank Sinatra, who had worked with both women, famously said, "Doris is the girl you marry. Marilyn is the girl you dream about. But a man can only choose one, and that choice says everything about who he really is." The rivalry reached its peak during the filming of Some Like It Hot and Night. Billy Wilder, who was directing Marilyn in the film, had originally wanted Doris for the female lead. When Marilyn heard about this, she campaigned aggressively to keep Doris off the project. "She'll ruin the chemistry," Marilyn told Wilder. "The audience won't believe Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon would go to all that trouble for someone so wholesome." Wilder gave in to Marilyn's demands, but the decision created a permanent rift between him and Doris. She never forgave him for choosing Marilyn's sexuality over her talent. The feud also played out in their personal lives in increasingly petty ways. They began showing up to the same restaurants, parties, and premieres, each trying to prove who was more beloved by Hollywood elite. At the 1959 Golden Globes, they were seated at tables directly across from each other. The cameras caught every glance, every smile, every subtle slight. Entertainment reporters noted that they never looked directly at each other during the entire ceremony. The most vicious battle came over the role of Sugar Cane in Some Like It Hot. Both women wanted to prove they could handle comedy, and both saw the part as crucial to their careers. Doris felt the role was perfect for her, a sweet, naive singer who gets caught up in romantic complications. It was exactly the type of part she had built her career on. Marilyn saw it differently. She believed the role required a woman with real sex appeal, someone who could make the audience believe that two men would dress as women just to be near her. The battle for the role was fought behind closed doors, with agents, managers and studio executives all taking sides. Ultimately, Marilyn won. But the victory came at a cost. Doris never forgot the betrayal, and she began actively working to undermine Marilyn's career. The rivalry became so intense that it began affecting both women's health and personal relationships. Friends reported that both Doris and Marilyn were obsessed with what the other was doing, constantly asking for updates on each other's projects and personal lives. Marilyn began taking acting classes partly to prove she could be as versatile as Doris. Doris began experimenting with more glamorous looks and sexier roles to prove she could compete with Marilyn's appeal. The competition was destroying what made each of them special. In trying to beat the other woman at her own game, both were losing what had made them unique in the first place. The breaking point came in 1960 at a private party celebrating the completion of Marilyn's film The Misfit. Both women were in attendance, and the tension in the room was palpable from the moment Doris arrived. They had been avoiding direct contact for months, but that night, fueled by alcohol and years of suppressed hostility, they finally had the confrontation that had been building for 7 years. It started innocuously enough. Marilyn was holding court near the bar, surrounded by admirers, when Doris approached to order a drink. "Doris, how wonderful to see you," Marilyn said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "I heard about your new picture, another wholesome family film." The insult was barely veiled. In Hollywood terms, calling someone's work wholesome was often code for boring and unchallenging. Doris smiled sweetly. "Yes, it's about real people with real problems. You know, the kind of thing that requires actual acting." The group around them went silent. Marilyn's face flushed, but she maintained her smile. "Oh, honey, we all act it. The only difference is some of us admit it. And some of us," Doris replied, "don't need to take our clothes off to get attention." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Marilyn's mask of sweetness finally slipped completely. "At least when I take my clothes off, people want to look," Marilyn shot back. "When you take yours off, they probably ask for their money back." The party guests were frozen, watching two of the most famous women in the world tear each other apart in public. Doris leaned closer to Marilyn. "You know what your problem is. You think being desired is the same as being loved. But desire fades, and when it does, what's left? Nothing." Marilyn's response was quick and cruel. "And you think being safe is the same as being interesting. But safe is just another word for forgettable." The exchange might have continued, but other guests intervened, separating the two women before the situation could escalate further. But the damage was done. Word of their public confrontation spread through Hollywood within hours. The incident marked the end of any pretense of civility between them. From that point on, their rivalry became openly hostile. Both women began actively sabotaging each other's career. Doris used her influence to have Marilyn excluded from certain projects. Marilyn responded by spreading rumors about Doris's personal life and professional behavior. The feud reached its most destructive point when both women were considered for the lead role in the film adaptation of the Broadway musical Gypsy. The role of Gypsy Rose Lee required someone who could portray both innocence and sexuality, making it perfect for either actor. The battle for Gypsy became a proxy war for their larger rivalry. Studios, agents, directors, and even other actors were forced to choose sides. The fight became so ugly that eventually neither woman got the part. Rosalind Russell was cast instead, as a compromise candidate who couldn't be seen as a victory for either camp. The failure to land Gypsy was a wake-up call for both women. Their rivalry had become so consuming that it was destroying opportunities for both of them. Hollywood was getting tired of their feud, and producers were beginning to avoid projects that might require them to work with either woman. The first sign of change came in 1961, when Marilyn was hospitalized for exhaustion and depression. Despite their bitter rivalry, Doris was among the first to send flowers and a get well card. The note was simple: "Get well soon. Hollywood needs you, whether I like it or not." Marilyn was surprised by the gesture. In their years of warfare, she had forgotten that underneath all the competition, they were both women trying to survive in an industry that was often brutal to female stars. When Marilyn was released from the hospital, she called Doris personally to thank her. "I didn't expect flowers from you," Marilyn said. "I didn't expect to send them." Doris replied honestly, "But seeing you in the hospital made me remember something I'd forgotten. We're not really each other's enemy. This business is." That conversation didn't end their rivalry immediately, but it marked the beginning of a gradual thaw. Both women began to realize that their competition had been manipulated and exploited by an industry that benefited from pitting women against each other. They began to see how the studios had deliberately created and nurtured their feud as a marketing tool, using their rivalry to generate publicity for both their films and career. The press had played along, always ready with articles comparing them, ranking them, and asking other celebrities to choose sides. The rivalry had sold magazines and newspapers, but it had also limited both women's opportunities and damaged their mental health. By early 1962, both Doris and Marilyn were making an effort to be more civil to each other in public. They began attending some of the same events again, though they still kept their distance. The tragedy of Marilyn's death in August 1962 ended any possibility of a complete reconciliation, but it also gave Doris perspective on what their rivalry had really cost. At Marilyn's funeral, Doris was among the celebrities who attended to pay their respects. She later said it was one of the most difficult things she had ever done. Standing there, looking at that coffin, I realized how much time we had wasted. Doris reflected years later. We could have been friends. We could have supported each other. Instead, we let other people turn us into enemies. In the decades following Marilyn's death, Doris rarely spoke publicly about their rivalry. When she did, it was with regret and a clear understanding of how they had both been manipulated. Marilyn and I were never really competing with each other, she said in a 1985 interview. We were competing with the images that other people had created for us. She was trying to prove she was more than just a sex symbol, and I was trying to prove I was more than just wholesome. We should have been helping each other instead of fighting. The rivalry between Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe became a cautionary tale about how the entertainment industry pits women against each other for profit. It showed how competition between female stars could be manufactured and exploited, often to the detriment of both women involved. Looking back, it's clear that both women lost more than they gained from their feud. Doris spent years trying to prove she was sexier than Marilyn, which led her away from the kinds of roles that had made her famous. Marilyn spent years trying to prove she was more serious than Doris, which added pressure to an already fragile psyche. The tragedy is that they actually had much more in common than they realized. Both were ambitious, talented women trying to control their own careers in an industry that preferred to control them. Both struggled with the limitations of their public images and wanted to be seen as complete human beings rather than one-dimensional symbols. Their rivalry split Hollywood for nearly a decade, forcing everyone in the industry to choose sides in a battle that ultimately served no one's interests except those who profited from the conflict. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of their feud is the lesson it teaches about the cost of competition between women in a male-dominated industry. When women fight each other instead of fighting the system that limits them both, everyone loses. Doris Day lived until 2019, giving her more than 50 years to reflect on her rivalry with Marilyn Monroe. In her final interviews, she expressed only sadness about their feud. "If I could go back and change one thing about my career," she said, "it would be to reach out to Marilyn sooner. We could have been allies instead of enemies. We could have changed things together." The hidden rivalry between Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe didn't just split Hollywood. It revealed the fault lines in an industry that has always struggled with how to value women's contribution. Their story serves as both entertainment and warning. When society insists there's only room for one woman at the top, it's not just the women who lose. Everyone does.